Please leave a comment where in the world you are listening from. I've been on 2 blind dates. One ended with me getting hot tea poured deliberately into my lap, and the other one was a fucking disaster. Several years ago, I went through a period of pretty low self-esteem. I had just gotten out of the military and had a 5-year-long relationship end on bad terms. I was adrift in life, and women could smell it on me. It was like I had a phantasmal neon sign above my head that read, mid-20s male. Brash, annoying, desperate, clingy. There was no love out there for your faithful scribe. I did what every idiot does at that point, which was to convince myself that if I could just get the right girl, everything would look up. The ladies were not so enthusiastic about my cart before the hoarseness. I turned to eHarmony to remedy this unfortunate situation. After the month-long vetting process, I finally arranged a date. The girl was a Mary Kay salesperson. Makeup ladies are hot, right? And seemed to be about where I was in life. I drove over to her apartment to take her to dinner, visions of meeting my future wife playing in my head. I just knew that this would be the one. We were going to become a team and pull each other out of our collective funks, building each other's self-esteem. Together, we were going to conquer the world. I pulled up outside her building. She didn't give me her actual apartment number for PERSEC reasons, in the rain, and called her. After she said she was coming out, I began watching for her. I am a gentleman and always open the door for a lady, but I wanted to stay in my warm, dry truck as long as possible. After several false alarms, I heard a knock on my passenger side door. My finely tuned jungle sense had somehow missed the future love of my life walking across the parking lot. I sprung into action, much chagrined. Had I messed up her first impression already? I hopped out and went around to the passenger side door. The creature I beheld was nothing like the one that had danced in my mind on the trip over. There were no long, lean thighs. There was no feminine jawline, no perfect, but tastefully concealed, bosom pushing through a sheer, but tasteful, you see, blouse. Absent were soulful, but glinting with subtle mischief. Eyes. I was looking at a human tub of shit. This poor girl had let herself go to the point of repulsiveness. She had 2.5 chins, a panus that hung to her knock knees, and tiny, beady eyes that were permanently squinting due to the oppressive weight of facial fat. Dear reader, I believe I actually took several steps back. Hi, Savage Henry. I'm so excited to meet you. Where are we going to eat? My mind raced. I had reservations at a 5-star restaurant. I was prepared to invest $300 or $400 on dinner with the vision in my head. There is no sense skimping on the woman who was to be my salvation, I had reasoned. But this? Hell no. I figured we could head over to the Macaroni Grill. They have pretty good food, I guess. Quick thinking, right? Smooth too. Not smooth or quick enough to back out of this date, though. I was bullied into opening the truck door by social convention, and my inability to be a total asshole to an obese girl. Have you ever seen films of the paratroopers getting on planes prior to jumping into Normandy? Burdened by 100 pounds of gear and parachute, those brave men struggled up the ladders into DC-3s, teetering on the threshold until they got a helpful shove from the man behind them. Watching this woman get into my truck was quite similar. She huffed and puffed, quivered and jiggled, and finally slopped herself into the passenger's seat. My huge Dodge truck with a 3/4-ton suspension groaned. When I got back on my side, I swear my truck had a 10-degree list to starboard. Walking into the restaurant with her, I was as embarrassed as I have been since a very unfortunate incident in 4th grade. The men cast pitying looks at me, and the women were not much better. The servers looked at her greedily, knowing there was economic opportunity in a woman who obviously ate so much. Dinner conversation was uncomfortable, until I struck upon an idea. I asked about her past relationships. If I wasn't going to get to know the future Mrs. Savage Henry, I could at least do anthropological research into the kind of man who sought a woman such as this. She was emboldened by my seeming interest in her. Oh, I don't date a lot. I was seeing this guy for a while, but he cheated on me and gave me an STD. Oh, an STD? So what did you get? Like she had won a raffle or grab bag or something. I have genital warts. Don't worry though. I get them frozen off and you won't catch anything. We can still have sex. I hope we do have sex later. I'm having a really good time with you. I promise it will be great. The last part was said with what I assume was a conspiratorial wink, but it looked like some adipose-triggered facial tic. Okay, I said. That was the final blow for me. At that point in my life, I might have sunk so low as to use this poor creature for sex, but the thought of warts on my unit put the kibosh on that. We sped through dinner, her surely thinking I was excited by the promise of wading through folds of Limburger-scented chub in search of her diseased lady parts, and me wishing for an ejection seat instead of a booth. When we pulled up in front of her apartment building after dinner, I made the usual excuses about being tired and having to work early in the morning. "You'll call me, right?" I envisioned her very own phantasmal neon sign spinning over her head. It read female mid-20s. Fat, boring, desperate, and a permanent fucking STD. I went home, deleted her number, and drank half a bottle of Jack. When I first matched with her on the app, it felt promising. Let's call her Emily. She had this bright, disarming smile in her pictures, one that felt both genuine and intriguing. Our initial conversation was effortless, filled with humor and just the right amount of flirtation. It was rare to find that kind of spark online, but sparks can be misleading. By the end of our first evening texting, I felt hopeful. Emily was sharp, funny, and seemed down to earth. We traded banter, talked about favorite movies, and even shared playlists. For once, it felt like this wasn't going to be another dead-end match. I was wrong. On day 3, her messages began to shift. It wasn't gradual. It was like turning a page in a book and realizing you're suddenly in a completely different story. Out of nowhere, Emily started sharing deeply personal details about her life. She talked about therapy sessions, past betrayals, and family issues, painting a picture of someone who had clearly been through a lot. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't mind that she'd opened up. Vulnerability isn't a bad thing, but this felt abrupt, almost out of context. Just 2 days earlier, we'd been laughing about bad karaoke experiences, and now we were diving headfirst into her emotional scars. It was jarring. I listened as best I could, sending supportive responses, though I didn't feel we'd earned that level of intimacy yet. Trust takes time, and I wasn't ready to carry someone else's weight, not when I barely knew them. Still, I figured it was just a moment. She'd recalibrate, right? I hoped. By day 5, the universe had other plans for me. That morning, I saw something my ex posted online. It wasn't anything dramatic, a photo, a casual caption, but it hit me harder than I cared to admit. Grief isn't linear, and heartbreak doesn't keep to a schedule. It gutted me. Suddenly, every ounce of energy I had drained out of me. I wasn't angry or bitter, just hollow. I wasn't ready to talk to anyone that day, least of all Emily, someone I barely knew. When her text popped up mid-morning, cheerfully asking how my day was going, I stared at my phone for a moment before replying. I needed space, I told her. I explained it kindly, honestly, or at least I thought I had. I figured she'd understand. Minutes passed. Then an hour. No reply. I assumed she'd taken it in stride. I set my phone down, crawled into bed, and let the world slip away for a little while. When I picked up my phone a few hours later, everything had changed. From missed calls, 9 unread texts. My stomach sank as I scrolled through the notifications, each one heavier than the last. The texts weren't the light-hearted kind, the hope you're okay messages a friend might send. No, these were diatribes, paragraphs filled with frustration, accusation, and melodrama. "This always happens to me," she wrote. "Every time I open up to someone, they push me away. I thought you were different." The words felt less like a plea for understanding and more like a hammer of guilt, wielded with precision. I was apparently revealing my true colors. Her tone was relentless, painting herself as the victim of yet another failed connection, and me as the perpetrator of some imagined cruelty. I didn't know how to respond, or if I even wanted to. I barely knew this woman, yet she was demanding an explanation, an apology, as if I owed her something. I didn't. Not after 5 days of texting. Not after what was, at best, a passing connection. I let the messages sit there, unanswered. The next morning, I sent her one final text. I kept it brief and polite, though every word felt like walking a tightrope. I told her this wasn't going to work out, and wished her the best. Then, without waiting for a response, I blocked her number. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. Blocking someone felt extreme, but Emily had shown her hand. Her reaction wasn't just intense, it was a red flag the size of a billboard. I realized I wasn't ready to date anyway. Maybe it was a blessing in disguise, a favor she'd unwittingly done for me by showing me what I wasn't ready to handle. For weeks, I thought about her only in passing. Occasionally, I'd remember her words and feel a pang of discomfort, but mostly I moved on. My focus shifted inward. Time spent healing, reflecting, rediscovering what I wanted and needed. Slowly, I felt like myself again. And then last night, she found me. I was scrolling through Facebook, mindlessly liking photos of old classmates and distant cousins, when the notification popped up. A friend request from her. My heart skipped a beat. Emily. Her profile picture was unmistakable, that same bright, disarming smile. But how? I had never given her my last name. We hadn't exchanged social media handles, or even mentioned mutual friends. Yet there she was, finding me in the vast, endless expanse of the internet. It was unsettling, to say the least. For a moment, I stared at the screen, unsure of what to do. My thumb hovered over the delete request button, but curiosity nagged at me. How had she tracked me down? Was this some kind of coincidence, or had she gone digging for information? I clicked her profile, scrolling through her posts and photos. It was a strange feeling, seeing someone's curated life after you'd glimpsed the raw, unfiltered version of them. Her timeline was cheerful, polished, filled with inspirational quotes and selfies. If you didn't know better, you'd think she was just another happy, well-adjusted person. But I knew better. I deleted the request without hesitation. Whatever Emily was looking for, it wasn't something I could give her. Whether she was seeking closure or rekindling whatever connection she thought we'd had, I wanted no part of it. That chapter of my life, brief, chaotic, and bewildering as it was, needed to stay closed. As I sat there, staring at the empty notification tab, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. Relief, mostly, but also a lingering unease. Emily had been a lesson, one I hadn't expected but desperately needed. Trust takes time, and not every spark is worth chasing. I powered down my phone, set it aside, and took a deep breath. The world felt quieter, safer without her presence looming in my digital periphery. It was over now, for good this time. Or at least, I hoped it was. I matched with her on Tinder a week ago. Julia. She was the kind of girl who'd turn heads back in high school. A magnetic smile, wild laughter that made you feel like you were the only one in on the joke. We'd never spoken much back then, but when her profile popped up, I couldn't swipe right fast enough. Her message came almost immediately. Dinner at my place next Friday? I make a killer lasagna. I wasn't one to turn down a home-cooked meal, especially not when it came with the possibility of rekindling some teenage fantasies. So there I was, pulling up to her place, an unassuming house in a quiet suburb, armed with a bottle of cheap wine and a half-decent button-up shirt. Butterflies swirled in my stomach as I knocked on the door. When she opened it, she looked even better than her pictures. Casual but alluring, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail, lips painted crimson. "Glad you made it," she said, her voice warm, inviting. "Come in." The smell of lasagna wafted through the air, mingling with the subtle vanilla scent of her perfume. I stepped into her living room, my eyes darting around. Cozy, clean, filled with personal touches, framed photos, mismatched throw pillows. Then I saw the kid, a tiny human parked on the couch, watching cartoons, completely unfazed by my presence. "Oh, this is Benji," Julia said with a shrug, as if she'd forgotten to mention the small fact of her motherhood. "He's 7. Cool with kids." I stammered out something vaguely agreeable. Kids were fine, I told myself, in small doses. Dinner was surprisingly good. Julia was charming, witty, every bit the girl I'd fantasized about back in school. Benji piped in occasionally, asking questions about my car or whether I could do a backflip. The whole scene was strangely domestic, but there was an energy between Julia and me, an unspoken tension crackling just beneath the surface. As the night wore on and Benji was shuffled off to bed, Julia's demeanor shifted. Her smile lingered longer, her touches grew bolder. "Want to head upstairs?" she asked, her voice a low purr. I followed her without hesitation. Her bedroom was dimly lit, the faint glow of candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. I barely had time to take it in before she was pulling me close, her lips on mine, hands exploring. The world outside faded, reduced to nothing but the heat between us. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sound. A faint, unmistakable noise that sliced through the moment like a knife. The slam of a car door. Julia froze. Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. "Shit," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. "He's home." I blinked, my brain sluggish to catch up. "Who's home?" "My husband," she hissed, grabbing at her clothes. "You have to go." "Husband?" The word hit me like a bucket of ice water. Adrenaline surged as I realized the gravity of the situation. "What the hell, Julia?" I whispered harshly, fumbling for my jeans. They were nowhere to be found. "Just get out," she urged, shoving my shirt into my hands. "Window go." I glanced at the window. 2 stories up, a sheer drop onto what looked like a rosebush-covered lawn. You can't be serious. Footsteps echoed from downstairs, heavy, deliberate. Julia's panic was contagious now, coursing through me like an electric shock. There wasn't time to argue. Heart pounding, I pushed open the window, cold air hitting my skin like a slap. "Go," she hissed again, shoving me toward the ledge. I swung one leg over, then the other, muttering a stream of curses under my breath. Below me, the yard stretched out like a dark abyss. I had no plan, no dignity, and absolutely no time. I jumped. The landing was less than graceful. Thorns tore at my bare legs as I tumbled into the bushes, biting back a scream. Pain radiated from my shoulder, but there was no time to assess the damage. Somewhere inside, I could hear voices, Julia's husband, confused, demanding answers. "Thought you said you were working late," I heard her say, her voice strained but steady. A masterclass in damage control. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline dulling the pain. Barefoot, shirtless, and in nothing but my boxers, I bolted across the yard. The cold ground stung my feet as I sprinted for the safety of my car, parked a block away. Behind me, a light flicked on. I didn't look back to see if anyone was watching. I didn't want to know. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, lungs burning, heart hammering like a drum. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, glancing around to make sure no one had followed me. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, suffocating. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. My shoulder throbbed, and I noticed for the first time that my boxers were shredded, tiny red scratches crisscrossing my thighs. What the hell is wrong with people? I muttered to no one. The absurdity of it all hit me then. The lasagna, the kid, the husband, the damn rosebush. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my chest, spilling out before I could stop it. I was half naked, bruised, and bleeding in the middle of suburbia, and all I could do was laugh. The drive home was a blur. By the time I stumbled into my apartment, the adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a dull ache and a bone-deep exhaustion. I collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying the night over and over in my head. The audacity of it, the betrayal, the sheer, chaotic absurdity. Part of me wanted to text Julia, demand answers, call her out on her lies. But what would be the point? She wasn't the girl I thought she was, and I sure as hell wasn't about to be her collateral damage. I dodged a bullet tonight, barely. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I made a silent vow. No more Tinder, no more lasagna, and absolutely no more married women. We'd matched a week earlier. His name was Ryan. Clean-cut, quick-witted, and charming in a way that seemed effortless. He had a smile that could disarm you and an easy confidence that made you want to trust him. Maybe that was the problem. The date itself was fine. Dinner at a small Italian restaurant. He was attentive, asked all the right questions, and kept the conversation light and engaging. If there were any red flags, I missed them entirely. By the time he offered to drive me home, I felt relaxed. Safe. I should have known better. It started with a rolling stop. We'd barely made it 2 blocks when he slid through a stop sign without even pretending to slow down. My brow furrowed, but I didn't say anything. Maybe he didn't see it. Maybe it was just an honest mistake. But then, a few minutes later, he took a left turn where a large, glaring sign clearly read "No left turn." My unease deepened as I glanced at him. "Ryan," I said hesitantly. "I think that was illegal." He chuckled, brushing it off like it was no big deal. "It's fine. Nobody's out here this late." As if on cue, flashing red and blue lights lit up the rearview mirror, accompanied by the wail of a siren. My stomach dropped. He cursed under his breath, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. "Pull over," I said, my voice a mix of urgency and disbelief. He didn't. Instead, he muttered, "I can't do this right now," and slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, pinning me against the seat as we sped down the empty street. My heart was in my throat, panic clawing at my chest. "What are you doing?" I shouted, gripping the door handle as if it might somehow save me. "I just need to lose them," he said, his voice steady in a way that terrified me even more. "It'll be fine. Trust me." Trust him? Trust him? The man who'd just turned a routine traffic stop into a car chase? My head spun as I tried to process what was happening. The sirens grew louder, the flashing lights brighter, as the police car closed in behind us. "Ryan, this is insane. Stop the car," I begged, but he was too focused on the road, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white on the wheel. He made a sharp turn onto a residential street, the tires screeching beneath us. Houses blurred past as he scanned for somewhere to hide. Finally, he veered into a random driveway, killing the engine and plunging us into silence. "Stay quiet," he whispered, as if this were some kind of spy movie and not a life-altering disaster unfolding in real time. I sat frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears, as the police car slowed at the end of the street. For a brief, agonizing moment, I thought they might pass us by. But then the car stopped. The lights cut off, and the officers got out. The next few minutes were a chaotic blur. The police approached the car with weapons drawn, shouting commands I could barely process through the fog of panic. "Hands where we can see them. Both of you, out of the vehicle, now." My hands trembled as I fumbled with the seatbelt, my mind racing. I wasn't even sure if I could stand. My legs felt like jelly. Ryan stepped out first, his movements slow and deliberate, as if this was all just a minor inconvenience. "It's not what it looks like," he said calmly, raising his hands. But it was exactly what it looked like. And worse. I followed him out, my hands shaking as I lifted them above my head. The officers moved quickly, barking orders, their flashlights blinding in the darkness. Before I knew it, I was in handcuffs, the cold metal biting into my wrists. "Wait!" I stammered, my voice cracking. "I didn't do anything. I don't even know what's going on." The officers weren't interested in my protests. They marched us to the curb, sat us down, and began searching the car. Ryan was eerily quiet, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, my mind raced with questions and fears. How had this gone so wrong? Who was this man? And why, in the name of all that was sane, had I agreed to get in his car? It didn't take long for the truth to come out. One of the officers emerged from the car, holding a radio in one hand and a file in the other. His expression was grim. "This car's stolen," he announced, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. My stomach dropped. I stared at Ryan, horrified, but he didn't even flinch. "And he's got outstanding warrants," the officer continued, glancing down at the file. "We'll need to extradite him." I could barely breathe. Stolen car? Warrants? What kind of person had I just spent the evening with? The officers pulled Ryan to his feet, reading him his rights as they led him to the patrol car. He didn't look back. Not once. As for me, they removed the handcuffs but didn't let me go. Not right away. They asked me questions, how I knew him, what I knew about the car, whether I was involved in any of his crimes. I answered as best I could, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. Eventually they believed me. They offered me a ride home, and though the thought of getting into another car, any car, made my skin crawl, I didn't have much choice. The ride was silent, except for the officer driving. "You're lucky," he said after a long pause. "Guys like that, they don't usually stop at traffic violations. Could have been worse." I nodded numbly, staring out the window as the city blurred past. Lucky? I didn't feel lucky. I felt shaken, exposed, and deeply, profoundly stupid. How had I missed the signs? Or were there even signs to miss? When we finally pulled up to my apartment, I thanked the officer quietly and slipped inside. The moment the door closed behind me, I sank to the floor, my entire body trembling. I never saw Ryan again. From what the police told me, he was extradited to another state the following week. His outstanding warrants included everything from grand theft auto to fraud. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that drive, about the look on his face as the sirens closed in, about the calm way he'd said, "Trust me," as if trust could ever survive something like that. And I think about how close I came to becoming a footnote in his story, another casualty of his recklessness. It was a lesson I wouldn't forget. Sometimes, danger doesn't come with warning signs. Sometimes, it comes with a charming smile and an offer to drive you home. The night began with such promise. It was a quaint little restaurant, the kind with dim lighting, warm wooden accents, and a soft hum of classical music in the background. The kind of place where you'd imagine love stories beginning over candlelight. That's what I was hoping for, at least a story worth telling. When he walked in, I thought maybe I'd found it. He was handsome in a boyish way, rumpled dark hair, a slightly crooked smile, and a nervous energy that felt endearing rather than off-putting. Let's call him Daniel. He greeted me with a genuine warmth that immediately put me at ease, and as we settled into our table, the conversation flowed naturally. No awkward pauses, no rehearsed lines. Just two strangers learning about each other over shared glances and laughter. For the first 20 minutes, everything was perfect. Then, the waiter came to take our order. I'd barely scanned the menu before deciding on the chicken Alfredo. Simple, safe, and reliably delicious. Daniel followed my lead, ordering the steak medium rare. Nothing unusual. The waiter smiled, jotted down our choices, and disappeared into the flow of the busy dining room. That's when Daniel's demeanor shifted. It was subtle at first. He became quieter, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for something, or someone. I asked him if everything was okay, and he offered a tight-lipped smile, assuring me it was. But his gaze never quite landed on mine. "I'll be right back," he said abruptly, pushing his chair back. "Just need to step out for a second." I nodded, confused but polite. Maybe he needed the restroom. Maybe he was just nervous and needed a moment to gather himself. I sipped my water, glancing around at the other couples and groups of friends enjoying their meals. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I checked my phone. Nothing. By the time 15 minutes rolled around, I was ready to leave. I'd been ghosted before, but never this dramatically. I started calculating how much cash I had in my purse, wondering if I should pay for both our meals out of sheer embarrassment, when the door to the restaurant swung open. There he was. At first glance, Daniel looked off. His eyes were red and glassy, and his steps were slow, like he was dragging himself back to the table. My immediate thought was that he'd gone outside to smoke. A quick puff to calm his nerves, maybe. I hated smoking, always had, so right then and there, I knew the rest of the date was pointless. A deal breaker is a deal breaker. But then, as he sat down across from me, I noticed something else. His hands were trembling. His breathing was uneven, like he'd just run a marathon. Before I could ask what had happened, he looked at me with an apologetic expression so raw, so vulnerable, that I felt my annoyance falter. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to disappear like that. It's just," he hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "You ordered the chicken Alfredo." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "What?" He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "My ex always ordered the chicken Alfredo. Every time we went out. It was her favorite. And when you said it, it hit me. I wasn't expecting it. I had to step outside." The words hung in the air between us, surreal and disorienting. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to piece together what he was telling me. "You left because I ordered chicken Alfredo." I asked, my voice cautious, disbelieving. He nodded, his eyes glistening with something I could only describe as heartbreak. "I tried to stay," he said, his voice cracking. "But I couldn't. I went in my car, and I cried. He cried. In his car. Over chicken Alfredo." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to laugh, to shake him and tell him how absurd this all was. Another part wanted to reach across the table and offer him some kind of comfort. But mostly I just felt trapped. Trapped in this moment, in this story that wasn't mine but was now uncomfortably tied to me. "Daniel," I began carefully, "I'm really sorry that you're still hurting over your ex. But maybe you're not ready to be dating." He flinched, like the words stung, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he let out a hollow laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "I thought I was," he admitted. "I really did. But when you said those words, it was like she was here. Like I could hear her voice again, see her sitting there across from me." I nodded slowly, my discomfort growing with every passing second. I didn't know this man. I didn't know his ex. But suddenly, I was a ghost in his memory, a stand-in for something he couldn't let go of. The rest of the evening limped forward like a wounded animal. Our meals arrived, and while the chicken Alfredo was as delicious as ever, it was hard to enjoy it under the weight of Daniel's sorrow. He picked at his steak, barely eating, offering apologies between long silences. I tried to keep the conversation light, steering it away from his ex and the overwhelming shadow she'd cast over our date, but it was like trying to fill a sinking ship with a bucket. The night was irreparably ruined. By the time the check arrived, I was counting the seconds until I could leave. Daniel offered to pay, but I insisted we split it. I didn't want to owe him anything, not a cent, not a memory, nothing. As we stood outside the restaurant, the chill of the night air biting at my skin, he looked at me with that same wounded expression. "I really am sorry," he said. "You didn't deserve that." I forced a polite smile, already taking a step back. "It's okay. Take care of yourself, Daniel." He nodded, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and walked away into the night. I watched him go, a strange mix of pity and relief swirling in my chest. Bucharest, 2017. A city alive with old-world charm and electric energy. I was there for a week, soaking in the culture, the history, the cobblestone streets that seemed to echo whispers from the past. It was the kind of place where anything felt possible: romance, adventure, even danger. And that's where I met her. Her name was Alina. We matched on Tinder late one night while I sat in a dimly lit cafe, sipping something strong and unfamiliar. Her photos were captivating: dark, striking eyes, a mischievous smile that felt like it held secrets. She messaged me first. Confident, witty. It didn't take long before we'd arranged to meet for dinner. That night, I arrived at the restaurant a little early. It was a cozy, intimate place tucked away in one of the quieter corners of the city. Warm light spilled from the windows, painting golden pools on the cobblestones. As I stepped inside, the low murmur of voices and clinking glasses wrapped around me like a blanket. And there she was, waiting for me at a table near the back. Alina looked even more stunning in person. Her dress hugged her figure just enough to turn heads, but it was her presence that commanded attention. She stood as I approached, her smile magnetic, her handshake firm but warm. "I was starting to think you'd stood me up," she teased, her voice low and velvety. "Not a chance," I replied, though my stomach fluttered. We settled into the evening easily, or so it seemed. Conversation flowed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. She was captivating, after all, and I was just some guy passing through a city where she probably had her pick of admirers. But as the night wore on, the unease grew. It wasn't her words. Those were charming, even clever. It wasn't her demeanor, either. She laughed in all the right places, asked thoughtful questions, and leaned in just enough to make it feel like I was the only man in the room. No, it wasn't anything she did. It was something deeper. A gut feeling. A prickle at the back of my neck. Like I was being watched. Or hunted. By the time the plates were cleared and the wine glasses were drained, I was ready to call it a night. "This was nice," I said, leaning back in my chair. "But I should probably head back. Early morning tomorrow." Her smile faltered, just for a moment. So brief I almost missed it. "Come on," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "The night's still young. Let's go back to my place. Just one more drink." It wasn't the first time I'd been invited back to someone's place. Usually I didn't hesitate. But tonight, the pit in my stomach twisted tighter, a visceral warning I couldn't ignore. I smiled politely, trying to soften the blow. "I really appreciate the offer, but I should get some rest." Her eyes darkened, the playful spark in them dimming. She sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she'd let it go. And then it happened. The movement was so quick, so sudden, that I barely registered it at first. One moment, she was sitting there, her face a mask of cool indifference. The next, her hand darted out, grabbing the steak knife from the table. I didn't have time to react. I didn't even see it coming. The blade sank into my stomach with a sickening, surreal pressure. There was no immediate pain, just a rush of confusion, a blur of movement as she pulled back, the knife still clutched in her hand. Time slowed. The room tilted. I stared down at the growing red stain on my shirt, my brain struggling to process what had just happened. She stabbed me. She actually stabbed me. The shock broke first. "What the?" I gasped, pushing back from the table, my chair scraping against the floor. My legs wobbled as I stood, one hand clutching my abdomen, the other gripping the edge of the table for balance. The pain hit then, sharp and deep, radiating through my torso like fire. Alina stood too, the knife still in her hand, her face unreadable. She didn't look angry or panicked, just calm. Detached. Like this was nothing more than a calculated move in some game I didn't understand. "You should have come home with me," she said, her voice eerily steady. Adrenaline surged, dulling the pain as survival instinct kicked in. I staggered backward, bumping into a nearby table. The other diners were staring now, their faces frozen in shock and horror. Someone screamed. A man jumped to his feet, shouting something in Romanian. "Help me!" I managed to choke out, blood trickling from the corner of my mouth. My legs buckled, but I caught myself on the edge of another table. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped, glasses shattered, and voices overlapped in frantic confusion. Alina didn't move, her dark eyes locked on me, as if she were waiting for something. Waiting for me to fall. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Somehow, I made it to the door. Hands grabbed at me, waiters, other patrons, their voices a blur of questions and shouts. I stumbled into the cold night air, the chill biting at my sweat-soaked skin. The pain was unbearable now, each step a jagged spike of agony radiating through my body. A cab was idling at the curb, the driver oblivious to the chaos spilling out behind me. I practically fell into the back seat, gasping out the name of the nearest hospital. The driver turned, his eyes widening when he saw the blood, but he didn't hesitate. The car lurched forward, the tires screeching as we sped through the narrow streets. The hospital was a blur of white lights and frantic voices. I was rushed into surgery, the world fading in and out as I drifted on the edge of consciousness. When I woke up, the police were waiting. I told them everything, the dinner, the knife, Alina. They listened, their faces grim. When I finished, one of the officers exchanged a look with his partner before turning back to me. "She's done this before," he said quietly. My blood ran cold. In the days that followed, I learned bits and pieces of the truth. Alina wasn't just some woman looking for a casual date. She had a history, a dark, violent past that no dating profile could ever reveal. I was lucky, they told me. Luckier than most. Even now, years later, I can still see her face in my nightmares. That calm, detached expression, the glint of the knife in her hand, the way she watched me bleed, as if I were nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience. Bucharest, 2017. A city alive with charm and danger. I'll never forget it. So Jane and I recently got in touch on MySpace. We knew of each other in high school, but were never really friends. I hosted a party not long after our MySpace encounter, and she came by for a while. I thought she looked really good, and we talked and bit, and had a nice time. I ended asking her to dinner a couple times afterwards. The first time she said yes and backed out. The second time she said maybe because of blah blah blah, but I never heard from her. So I chalked it up and forgot about her. I got a message from her months later apologizing, and telling me that she was dealing with some stuff from an ex, and had met some new people. But that was done, and she would like to still be invited to all my BBQs this summer. This is something about which we spoke at the party. I didn't get back to her right away, but eventually I accepted her apology and told her she was on the list. She responded by saying that she would love to see me again, and blah blah blah. Fast forward a week or so, and I get the opportunity to go to a fancy dinner party at a museum through work. They want to fill up a prepaid table, and my boss says they'll rent me a tux. So I start looking for a date, and Jane gets back to me and says she'd like to go. Hooray! The evening arrives, and I am all decked out in a tuxedo as I go to pick her up. She looks fabulous in a strapless black evening gown. She had recently dyed her hair black, too. It looked really good. When we enter the car, we start chatting a bit and catching up. Early on in the conversation, she apologizes if she is a little down because one of her co-workers was in the hospital, where she works as a lab tech, after being shot in the head by her husband in an attempted murder-suicide. I was of course flabbergasted. I told her we could of course cancel if she was too upset, but she said that she would be fine. I now think that she just made this up. Why do you ask? By the end of the story you'll agree that she doesn't need a reason. So we get to the museum, and we are probably the youngest people there. We valet the car and check our coats and head up to the bar, which is quite busy because everyone is being herded into the same area. As we wait for our first drink, she makes a negative comment about a fruity perfume that she considers foul. Out loud, in a conversational voice, she states, "What is the awful fruity smell? I think it might be her," referring to the woman standing right next to her, well within earshot. The woman obviously hears her and walks away. Jane comments that she thinks the woman heard her, but without an ounce of embarrassment or regret. I try and play it off, but I am very uncomfortable. We get our drinks, mingle, and after a while proceed down to dinner. At the dinner table we sat next to a co-worker and his wife, who happened to be a teacher. Teacher and Jane chatted a bit, and the conversation quickly moved to teaching and related stories and blah blah blah. Following this exchange, Jane turns to me and asks, "Why is it that teachers think everyone cares about their job? They all seem to think what they do is so amazing," etc. After inquiring today, it seems that the teacher wife didn't actually hear her say that, thank God, but it was definitely loud enough that I thought she might have. I was very embarrassed, but again tried to move the conversation towards a more reasonable tone and downplay how rude her comment had been. She also made a couple of snide comments during the speeches, to which we were forced to listen after we finished eating. I was pretty sure by this point that I was not going to call her again. But things got better. After the speeches, we went around the museum with our drinks and played around with all the exhibits, and caught the latter half of an IMAX show about the moon landing. As the evening drew to a close, the event ended at 11:30. We decided to go to Hip Bar downtown. We arrived at the bar after getting a little lost, which in a silly first date kind of way wasn't unpleasant, and proceeded up to the top to get a drink. The bar was packed, but we found an open table. We and another small group converged on the table at the same time, however, so we shared it with 3 chicks. They were nice enough, and we talked briefly with them while carrying on our own conversation. Eventually, she began another chapter of our conversation with, "Jim, I'm a mess, and you don't want anything to do with me." I wouldn't fully appreciate the truth and accuracy of this statement until much later. After she said this, she got into how very recently she went without alcohol for 6 months because she was an alcoholic. She then proceeded to show me a scar on her leg. I asked her if she got it falling down from being drunk. She said no. Then I asked her if she did it to herself. And she said yes. She told me about how she used to cut herself all the time, and on numerous occasions she had to get stitches because of it. She also told me that she was getting better and that she hadn't cut herself in 7 months. Now the evening had been going great since the aforementioned rude behavior, and I had been drinking, so the warning sirens in my head didn't go off nearly as loudly as they should have. The evening continued. 2 a.m. was fast approaching, and Jane decided she wanted to do one more shot. I tell her I have to drive, but since she insists on doing one with or without me, I join her. At the bar we bumped into someone whom she apparently met on a trip to the bathroom, and he invited us to some after-hours thing. She is all about it. The guy gives us terrible directions, which I don't mind because I'm not sure I want to go. As I go get the car from the valet, I see this guy's arm around her as she is talking to him and his friend, and I don't particularly like that. So when she comes to the car, I tell her that I'd prefer to go home, and if she wanted to go to the after-hours thing, she should go with those guys. She gets a little upset and apologizes and asks me, "Will you please come? I am having fun, and I want you to come." This continues for a bit, and I finally relent. It turns out that the directions we got were good, and had no trouble finding the place. I let her out OT use the restroom, and try to find a place to park. This turns out to be rather difficult. There are cars lining the street and filling the parking lot despite the fact that we are in the middle of an industrial district at 7 Mile and Mound, Detroit. I park entirely too far away for comfort and meet up with her in the parking lot. I tell her about my reservations about the neighborhood and the location of the car, but she really wants to go and says I can now park in the lot. This is true, since in the couple minutes it took me to park, some spaces had opened up. She eventually convinces me to go get the car, and even volunteers to stand in the space in order to guard it. Before I get to the space, some 1980s conversion van decides to take the space, and Jane is having none of it. With the van hanging halfway out of the space, they begin to argue, loudly. As many spots had opened up, I took another perfectly close and reasonably safe space, and then I have to try and get her to calm her ass down. Eventually she gives up, but as she leaves the space, she punches the guy's van. Now he is pissed off, so he starts yelling at her about the punch, and she is yelling at him about the parking space. He must realize that she is bats hit crazy, because he decides he doesn't want to throw down with her, a feeling she most definitely does not share, and tries to walk away. Jane of course gets in the guy's face, and will not let him pass. I finally physically remove her from his path, and she calls him a fucking pussy as he walks inside. Wow. We are warned not to enter the bar. So now I have to get her home, but she refuses to go into the car, opting instead for the ever-popular walk myself home 10 miles through the ghetto in the middle of the night wearing an evening gown option. I try to make it clear to her that there is no way I will allow this to happen, and try to coax her back to the car. It's not working. Next thing, the van guy comes out again, but this time he is trying to resolve the situation. He asks me if I will switch parking spaces with him to make her happy. I thank him, but say I'm just trying to get her home. Eventually I agree since she will not get into the car anyway, and I'm not going to leave her there, but when we begin the transfer she announces that all is well, and we should all go inside. And so we do. It turns out that this is most definitely a gay bar. But it's not crazy whips and chains gay, and they are still serving drinks until 5 a.m., and we see the folks we met at Centaur inside. I get us some drinks, I make sure hers is extra weak, and we start dancing. She tells me that she is sorry if I was scared in the parking lot, which I was a bit, and that she wouldn't make me fight the van guy, she would do it herself. Unfortunately for me, she said this while dancing sexily in front of me, so while I said that was nuts, and that's not how I operate, we continue to dance, begin to have an okay time. This okay times gets a little better when she begins to pull in proximate lesbians to our dancing. At the risk of sounding like a cliché, I find this to be a perfectly reasonable and positive turn of events. It gets less positive when I am no longer being danced with. Isn't this also a cliché? I decide to temporarily leave her to her ladies and go check this place out. I find our centaur compatriots again and talk a bit with them. I also talk to some folks that are inquiring about the relationship status between myself and my drunk date. I cannot tell them quickly enough that this is our first date. She is not my girlfriend. Jane seems to getting spacier and spacier as she starts grabbing unmentionable regions on the ladies with whom she is dancing. I speak with one gal in particular who seems really nice, and she actually helps me out at one point with Jane. Turns out that this gay bar has periodic performances by lip-syncing crossdressers, performances during which everyone is required to leave the small dance floor. I'd never seen anything like it before, and I found it to be rather amusing actually. If you've never seen a 6 feet, 275-pound black guy in a dress mouth the words to "Enough is enough," you haven't really lived. Apparently Jane does not think that this dance floor requirement applies to her, and she continues to dance. Then she is removed by who I am later told is the owner of the bar. Apparently he had warned her numerous times. I grab her, and with the help of my new friend Christine the hot lesbian, keep her off the stage. Of course, Jane is not about to let the owner of the bar tell her what to do, so she proceeds to slap the guy in the back of the head as he walks away. When I ask her about this a few minutes later, she tells me it was a joke. The owner did not find it funny. He grabbed her arm and threatened to throw her out of the bar hard. I remove her arm from his grip as I apologize and falsely assure him it was an accident. How fun! After the performance, she returns to the dance floor and starts dancing with every chick out there. After she is done with that, she starts randomly latching onto girls sitting at the bar. She seems to take a liking to one in particular and won't let her go. This girl seems to enjoy the craziness for a while, but eventually it becomes clear that Jane won't let her go. One of her lesbian friends, either a girlfriend or a wannabe girlfriend, starts to get a little upset. I see this and try to get Jane to release and come and dance with me, but she won't. So I shrug my shoulders to the upset lesbians and sit at the bar and just watch. Jane and her new girl go and dance, and Jane is running interference against the upset lesbian, i.e. Jane won't let her dance with anyone else. Now the upset lesbian is turning into the angry lesbian. After the dancing, Jane and company sit back down, together. From all indications, Jane is the only one happy about it. So 5 a.m. rolls around, and Jane is still connected to her new friend. At one point, at the urging of the lesbian gaggle, I wrap my arms around her waist and physically remove her from her friend. She immediately returns. Everyone is told that it is time to leave, so I try to hand Jane her coat, purse, and shoes. I am ignored. I try again to remove her and am unsuccessful. In frustration, I throw her stuff on a chair and go out to the car. I never make it there, however, because I start to feel bad. I am worried about what is going to happen to her, since everyone knows she is nuts and doesn't want anything to do with her. So I go back in long enough to hand Jane her coat and purse, but get left with her fucking shoes, and we leave the bar. In the parking lot, she still will not relent, and is now near tears and begging her new friend to take her home with her. While I stand right there, her new friend repeatedly declines. Somehow they are eventually separated. I hand Jane her shoes, and we walk to the car. I told her I would drive the car to her since she wasn't wearing shoes. I was ignored, and she walked through an ankle-deep puddle. We drove back to her apartment in complete silence, and without so much as my looking in her general direction. I wasn't even really angry. The situation was so messed up that I couldn't believe it had even happened. As we arrived at her apartment building, there were still no words from either of us. I stopped in front of her door, and she didn't get out. I told her that I would walk her to the door. When I open the door for her, she won't leave the car. We have a conversation that consists of her inquiring as to my reasons for being upset. I tell her that I am not mad nor even embarrassed, but that she should be. I told her that no one in that bar wanted anything to do with her by night's end, and that she really needed to get her shit together. I say this as nicely and delicately as I can. After this, she gets out of the car, and I walk her to the door. At the door of her building, I tell her that I had a really nice time for about 70% of the evening, and I tell her good night. But she isn't talking. She's just staring at me now. The stares are not creepy vacant zombie stares, but she is looking at me like she wants to me say or do something. Are you not even going to say goodbye to me? I ask. I get no response. I start asking her what she wanted, and try to get her to talk. But she won't. A couple times she gets out her keys like she is going inside, but doesn't. She just isn't talking, so I say goodnight again and begin to walk away. She simply says my name, John. It is enough to get me to turn around, since it is the only word she has said in the 5 minutes since we had left the car. But that's all I get. I again try to get her to say something else. Eventually I get to the point where I'm about to leave again. Again she says, John. This time I turn around, but I don't walk back to her. So she walks to me in the middle of the parking lot. So we're standing there, and she still doesn't have anything to say. Do not ask me what the hell I was thinking, because I don't even know. I say to her, what do you want from me? There are 3 things that can happen. We can either both go up and talk about what the hell your problem is. I can just leave, or you can come with me and we'll go get breakfast or something. What? Yeah, that was totally stupid. Then again, I am a man and she was my strapless evening gown wearing date that spent the whole evening dancing with lesbians. Of course I get nothing. So I decide that she is coming with me to go get breakfast, because it is now almost 5:45 a.m., and she implicitly agrees as she walks with me to the passenger door of the car. I open it, but she will not get in. So I close the door and tell her again that I'm leaving. As I walk to the driver's side of the car, she follows me there, still not speaking. Now I'm asking her what she wants from me. At one point she again takes out her keys and remotely starts up her car for some reason. I'm asking her why she won't speak, why she won't just go up to her apartment, why she keeps saying my name. Nothing. I twice more tell her again I'm leaving, and on both occasions I turn around to open the car door. She says, John. After this second time I tell her that I have no idea what is going on, but if she had something to say she had better say it. I told her that I was leaving right then, and that simply saying my name would not be enough to keep me from driving away. Since I got no response, I turned around and opened the driver's door again. This time, instead of saying my name, she balls up her fists and starts punching me in the back of the head. With both fists. As hard as she fucking can. So now I'm freaking out. I get popped a couple times in the ear and cheekbone as I turn before I grab her wrists and pin her down on an adjacent car. What the hell is wrong with you? And calm down are the only things I really say before I realize that I need to just get the hell out of there. I have a girl pinned on a car in the middle of the night in a parking lot. So I release her to get myself into the car, and the punching begins again. So now I am trying to deflect her wild punches and open the car door while she is punching and trying to keep the door closed. I eventually have to put my weight behind a really hard push to get her far enough away from me to allow for a lightning quick maneuver into the car. I think she must be a fucking ninja because she doesn't fall down. She almost immediately regains her balance and begins to punch the driver's window of the car. This continues until I am clear of her and drive away. To this day we still know some of the same people, but thankfully I never heard from her again. I'd been talking to a guy on Tinder for a while. I was abroad when he first started asking to meet up, so by the time we had been talking for around a month. He seemed nice and the conversation flowed, so I was looking forwards to the date. On the night I was waiting where we had agreed, and a guy walked past and gave a half smile. I thought nothing of this, as it is common for strangers to do this in this part of Newcastle, but I then realized he had stopped next to me, so I could only half see him. I turned to face him, and he said, "Are you coming then?" I then realized this was in fact the guy I had been talking to on Tinder for all this time. He looked so different from the photos, I didn't even recognize him. He was clearly the same person, but the photos must have been taken several years ago, and he had changed quite a bit since. This immediately made me feel uneasy, but I try not to be a judgmental person, and I am a person that cares more about personality than anything when it came to dating, so I went with it. As we start to walk, he told me that he hadn't been out for about 2 months, which was a little odd for a university student, but maybe he had just been working hard. I then asked why, and he completely ignored me and just randomly started singing in the middle of the street. Again, very odd, but I was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just nervous? He then said that he thought I was brave for coming out on a date with someone from a dating app, as he could be anyone, even a murderer or rapist. This started ringing alarm bells for me, as all this was starting to creep me out, and we hadn't even made it to the bar yet, which was down the road from where we had met. I really wanted to leave at this point, but I didn't want to be rude or hurt his feelings. So I was planning out in my head what to do. He had returned to singing at this point, and so he hadn't really noticed I wasn't paying attention. I then remembered a part of our text conversation where he had insisted on paying for my drinks on our prospective date, and I had refused until we struck a deal. He would pay for the first round, and if I was still interested, I would pay for the second. This meant that to escape the date, all I had to do was make it through one drink. We get to the bar, but as it's a match day, it's full, and the bouncers are saying no one's getting in. I then asked him where he wanted to go, and he replied that he didn't know anywhere else in the city. I'm not saying that being teetotal or staying in are bad, everyone has their own idea of fun, but it's a little weird to live in a city as a student for 4 years, which he had at this point, and only know one bar. So anyway, I just wanted to get this over with and feel safe, so I suggested going to my favorite pub, as it doesn't fill up that quickly on match day, and I know the staff there, so if there is a situation I could go to them for help. As we are walking there, he makes 2 or 3 more jokes about murdering me, interspersed by jokes like, "What do you call a cow with one leg?" "Steak," which are terrible, sorry if that's your kind of joke, which I didn't laugh at, but then he would say, "Oh, you like that? I love to see you laugh." I was not laughing, not even smiling. Honestly, at this point, I was just confused. So we get to the pub, and it's also full. We were standing outside the doors, and he said, "When we tell our grandchildren this story, we won't tell them we couldn't find anywhere to go." He then went in to hug me, but I quickly stepped to the side, so he just awkwardly fell against the wall next to me. At this point, he suggests that we go back to his to relax with a bottle of vodka. Now, he had already told me that he doesn't drink, so I'm thinking, who is going to be drinking all that vodka? Me. Why does he even own that much vodka if he doesn't drink? He then proceeds to make another joke about murdering me, so I'm thinking I have to find somewhere public to go so he can't kill me or whatever he's planning. And so I see the Frankie and Benny's across the road, which is empty, so I suggest we go there. Romantic, I know, but at least there were other people. Everything is fairly normal for a while, and we've got our drinks, and after we sit down, he said, "I told you a joke earlier, now you need to tell me one." I tried to laugh it off and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, but I don't know any as funny as yours." He didn't accept this as an answer and insisted I tell him one. So I tell him the only joke I know, which is truly awful BTW, and he says, "That joke was really terrible. I think I'm going to have to punish you for that." For about the 10th time during this date, I got chills down my spine. I don't even have the words to describe how sickeningly cringy it was to hear that. He then, before I get a chance to reply, asks, "If I were to ask nicely, would you let me impregnate you?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Who asks that on a first date? Especially when you are the only customers in a restaurant, and so all the staff can hear you. The staff were in fact all lined up at the bar, closely listening to this car crash of a date. I then politely decline his offer and proceed to down my drink. I couldn't take any more of this. I just wanted to go home and tell my flatmates this ridiculous story. He then asks, "So you going to get us another drink?" And suddenly the bit I had been dreading the most was here. I tried to be nice and told him that I was very sorry, but I just wasn't feeling a click and didn't think this was going to go any further. He then gets this look over his face like a hurt puppy. Honestly, I thought he was going to cry, and I instantly felt awful. He then asked me why, and I then had to just say again that I just didn't feel that click, and he blurts out, "Is it because of my looks?" Even though it genuinely wasn't because of his looks. Okay, they weren't what I expected, but it was definitely the weirdness that was putting me off. I instantly felt like a superficial B*TCH, and felt that what I had just done was exceptionally cruel. I know I can be quite easy to guilt. He then asks if I will stay with him to end the conversation, just while he finishes his drink. Considering how guilty I felt, I agreed. He then starts to ask me about a tragic event that had happened earlier in the year that had affected me for a while. After I explained the situation to him a bit, he took my hand and said, "It's okay, I will help you get through this." I then removed my hand and thanked him for his concern and the offer of help, but informed him that I had managed the situation myself and was fine. He had previously asked me about other sensitive events in my life over text, and for some reason I had told him, which is why I think he felt like the next comment was somehow supportive. He takes my hand again and says, "Do you think the reason you drink so much is to handle the pain?" I genuinely couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was he calling me an alcoholic on our first date? Don't get me wrong, I like a drink, but I am definitely not an alcoholic. He then continues, "I'm here for you. I can help you get out of this, and I'll support you in becoming sober and dealing with what happened to you." I honestly don't know what he was trying to do here, if he was trying to guilt me into spending more time with him, or convince me that I somehow need fixing, and need him for that, I don't know. I do try to be kind, patient, and considerate of others in life, but I was sick of this guy, so I stood up and told him I was leaving. He then had one final question for me. "Do you think you're a snob a bitch?" I silently put on my jacket and left. I got home by 8 p.m. and promptly told the story to my flatmates, a story that is now thankfully something we laugh about. Unfortunately, this isn't the only creepy/bad Tinder date story I've had to tell them. Do other people end up going on dates with creepy guys? My time to shine. Allow me to tell you the tale of when I went on a date with a Lovecraftian horror. A girl messaged me one night on OkCupid. The message was short and went something like, "Hey, you're cute, I love zombies too. I mentioned in my profile I'm a professional zombie actor. Text me." She looked decent in the one picture she had up, which really should have been a red flag. I texted her, and she wanted to set up a date for the following Monday, January 3rd, 2011. Fast forward to that night, and I'm driving to pick her up because she said she didn't have a car or a job. Red flag too. When my GPS led me to an empty grassy field, I called her and she told me to wait in the lot of the nearby Panera Bread. I waited a few minutes, and after a bit I see a figure emerge from the tree at the back of the field. I could see it was my date. Her hair was black and greasy in front of her face. She wore this billowy fishnet thing that kind of hid her figure. But the worst part was her lazy eye that just lolled and rolled about in her socket, and would settle and stare just several inches away from my face, so it seemed like she was staring at an invisible horn growing out the side of my head. I should have fled, but I was too much of a nice person, and if this bog witch wanted to go on a date, then by golly I'll do it. We go inside, and I immediately discover I have a pet peeve for people who talk several decibels higher than everyone else. I grab us a booth in the far corner, so she doesn't end up shouting our entire conversation. I say to her, "So tell me about yourself," which was probably the worst possible question for me to ask. She begins with talking about how she's not like other girls. She can pull off the goth/emo/punk look all at once. That most of her friends are furries, and they'd love to meet me. She's looking for a very obedient sub. She enjoys watching tranny threesomes, and she loves foot torture. Now this was definitely the third red flag, but at this point I made my bed and I'm sleeping in it. She asks me about myself, and I go on about my very normal hobbies and interests, and she's fighting me all along the way, telling me that airsoft promotes gun violence, and that I'll never go anywhere with a degree in graphic design. I did, thanks. She cuts me off and asks me to talk about any female friends I have. I begin to describe a few when she keeps jutting in with, "Well, she sounds like a bitch," and "I don't think she likes you." I stop and ask her if she has a problem, and she drops this line, "I need to eliminate all competition if I'm going to have a chance with you." Oh no. There's a long pause as I eat my food, but she eventually breaks the silence with asking me, "Do you know what really breaks the ice? Getting intimate. Want to hear a personal story? What wasn't personal already?" She goes on about some past relationship and how good it was, and everything seemed fine until it ended with, "And then he gave me herpes." Now that's all the fucking red flags. I stand up, tell her it was nice meeting her, but I have to leave. She follows me out and gets in my car with me. Of all the times I left the doors unlocked. She demands I drive her home. She tells me to pull up into the grassy field, which had a dirt road I couldn't see earlier. The dirt road goes into the woods, and I expected it to come out upon a clearing with a dilapidated shack, and a fire pit with animal bones, and a bog which she'll walk into and sink back to the depths from where she came. But no, it came out to a rather nice-looking house. But then she drops the line, "Yeah, I've been living here for the past 2 weeks with a guy I found on Craigslist." I pull up, she tries to kiss me. I push her back, tell her to get out of my car, and I drive away. I still remember her silhouette waving to me in my rearview mirror. I sped home, took a shower, acid washed my face, burned my clothes, and cried myself to sleep till Sunday morning. Remember, it was a Monday. A lot more has happened since that day, but this was the initial date. This date gone wrong had become a bit of a legend amongst my friends, and I usually end up telling it at every party. Clarify. I guess I should clear this up. I didn't go on more dates with her, just that the nightmare didn't stop after that night. I ran into her twice more in public since that day, but thankfully she never recognized me because I was in costume. The first time I saw her, she was holding hands with some gangly-looking dude, and the second time I saw her, she was pushing a carriage. A friend of mine who I told this story to met her at a Halloween party and drunkenly became friends with her. When I saw the photos of them arm in arm with each other on Facebook, I flipped shit. Told my friend she had become friends with Bog Witch, who then promptly dropped contact with her. Sometime later I had a falling out with this friend, and I guess in her version of a sick joke texted me a pic of pregnant Bog, which she found online. She looks like a fat gimpy hobbit. I show people the pic who don't believe me. Ain't no one seeing the pic unless you somehow catch me in person. It is my burden to seal the evil, not spread it. I also like my account not banned. I got one. I used OkCupid and other sites for a bit. I met some winners. Above and beyond the weirdest encounter was a girl that messaged me. A little backstory. I was near 300 pounds at the time the pic was taken. I didn't really feel the need to change it, as I hate pictures. I lost 100 plus pounds at the time, lean and in shape. Figuring this was okay, as most of the time it's the opposite problem of gaining. We start chatting. This girl is a 9, almost a 10 for me. Dark hair, thin, and has her own place. In internet dating, this is a gold mine. So we set up a time to meet in a local town where she goes to college. After work, I make my way over to said town to the Denny's. She tells me that she is there and sitting at a table by the window. I walk in and tell the waitress that I am looking for someone I am meeting. It's not busy, but there are several people. Suddenly I get a text. It's her, she says. No thanks, I thought you were bigger. Turns out she was scoping me from the parking lot, and bigger guys were her thing. Other oddities in dating was from Plenty of Fish. She was into role play and loved the Bonnie and Clyde/Harlequin and Joker idea. Trying to expand my boundaries, and she was friggin' hot. I say okay, I'm still about 250 at this time. She knows how big I am, and it's fine. We talk on the phone, and then we hang out at her place. Her friends are there, and we are getting along great. They leave and we are alone. She comes back with costumes of Joker and in a skin-tight Harlequin custom. Sweet. We do the deed, and it was fun. The deal breaker came in the middle of the night. She declined to mention she believed in certain things. I wake up to candlelight and her at the end of the bed in a black gown with tarot cards, just murder staring at me. She screams, "You are going to break my heart." I'm out. Another winner was a heroin addict that told me she wouldn't put out except if she were married. That night she drunkenly texts me to come over and bend her over a picnic table. There are a ton of these. Edit. Alright, I have a few more. Another one for Plenty of Fish. This girl messaged me and said she liked my profile, and I didn't seem like other guys. I was real shy still and very socially awkward. However, I was beginning to get my life together. Weight was about normal again, and I had a good steady job. None of that really matters, as we never went on a date. She gives me her Facebook, and we are just having a great time messaging. Really, this chick is a blast. And she's all over the place. Something I find endearing. Conversation just moves right along. And I guess I upset her when she just errantly says, "I want some gobstoppers," just after talking about her cat. I said, "That's weird." Everything goes dark. Facebook removal and Plenty of Fish blocked to her profile. Just gone. Meh. Last one. I do have more. I started talking to a girl, and she was really in the throes of depression. Life had beat her into submission, which was fine by me. I was indeed in a bad phase as well. I was just trying not to be lonely. This girl and I talk for about a week. Find out that I am working by her house. So she invites me over. It all seems great. We are hanging out watching TV, and it's about to winter storm. So I mention that I need to get going, and she asks me to stay shawing. We both are bigger. This is the defining moment I went weight loss centric. And things are easy for us to do, but we get it done. And we enjoy each other. So for the next week it's just us having fun, but she lives with her mom and stepbrothers. Everything about the stepdad was absent. Well, I have a pretty bad childhood. Some people took advantage of my drugged out mom, and I stayed over at someone's house a lot. Barring going into it, I'll just say I was a victim of some pedos. This is important to the story. Please don't do the feel sorry for me crap here. Another time. Well, I hold this secret pretty close to certain situations involving real life. People like the following actually exist. I tell her about my childhood, and apparently she told her mom. I get to her house one night about week 3, and her mom has a bat and is standing at the door telling me to fuck off. She doesn't want me around her boys because I may have urges to do to them what was done to me. She claims she talked to the police, and if I go inside they will arrest me for trying to have sex with her boys. Her boys are standing there with the WTF face. The girl I was dating is crying. I still am not mad at her or her mom. I'm shocked. It was the first time something done to me has been held against me as an adult. Attributing it to ignorance is the only thing I could do. But I never spoke to that outfit again. My first foray into Tinder was supposed to be a simple, low-stakes evening. It was about 6 years ago, and I figured it was time to give online dating a shot. Swipe, chat, meet, repeat. That was the idea. What could possibly go wrong? I matched with a woman who seemed decent. Her photos were nice, her profile was engaging, and our chats were light-hearted and fun. I made a reservation at a cozy restaurant, something casual but still a step above coffee, and we agreed to meet there. I remember feeling that strange mix of nerves and anticipation as I walked into the restaurant. But when I saw her sitting at the table, I stopped short. She looked nothing like her photos. It wasn't just a bad angle or lighting. It was as if I'd matched with an entirely different person. The polished, vibrant woman from the photos was replaced by someone who looked like she'd wandered in by mistake. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should turn around and leave, but my upbringing got the better of me. Be polite. Be decent. Everyone deserves a chance, right? I plastered on a smile and joined her at the table, determined to make the best of it. Maybe her personality would shine through. Maybe there was a reason she'd chosen such wildly misleading pictures. The waiter came, drinks were ordered, and soon we were making the usual first date small talk. But then the conversation took a turn. "So," she said, swirling her wine glass, "why are you on Tinder?" I gave the standard answer about wanting to meet new people, hoping to find someone special, and asked her the same question. Her response was something else. "Well," she began, her voice dropping conspiratorially, "my last relationship ended badly." That's never a great start, but I nodded politely, prompting her to continue. She leaned forward, her tone becoming serious. "My boyfriend's girlfriend told me that my boyfriend was actually married." I blinked, unsure if I'd misheard. "Wait, your boyfriend's girlfriend?" "Yeah," she said, completely unfazed. "He had a girlfriend and a wife. None of us knew about each other." I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around the layers of deception in her story. "So, how did you not know he was married?" "He looked a lot younger than he was," she explained, taking another sip of wine. "He said he was 50, but he was really older." I raised an eyebrow. "How much older?" She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her photos before showing me a picture. "This is him." The man staring back at me from her screen looked closer to 60, if not 65. At that point, I felt like I was trapped in a bad sitcom. How had this become my life? I'd walked into this evening expecting an ordinary first date, and now I was dissecting the double life of a man who had somehow juggled a wife, a girlfriend, and another girlfriend. I decided I'd had enough. "Listen," I said gently, "I really appreciate the date, but I don't think we're a match. I wish you all the best, but I think it's better if we go our separate ways." She looked surprised but didn't argue. I paid the bill, thanked her for her time, and excused myself. Relief washed over me as I stepped outside and called for a grab to take me home. But as I waited for the car, I noticed her standing next to me. I turned to her, confused. "What are you doing?" She shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "So, where are we going?" I stared at her, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm going to my home, and you're going to your home," I said, using my hands to gesture in opposite directions. She didn't say anything, just stood there watching me as I got into the car and left. I thought that was the end of it. The next morning, I was jolted out of bed by the sound of my doorbell ringing. Groggy and disoriented, I checked the video feed connected to my intercom, and my heart sank. It was her. She stood outside my door, shouting up at the camera, "Why haven't you texted me back? I thought we had a good time. Why are you ghosting me?" I rubbed my temples, trying to process what was happening. "I told you last night we weren't seeing each other again," I said into the intercom, my voice sharper than I intended. Her expression crumpled. "But why? I thought we had a connection." At this point, my patience had run out. "We didn't," I said bluntly. "Please leave." She started crying, loud, dramatic sobs that echoed through the quiet morning. I turned off the intercom, unwilling to engage any further. I watched through the video feed as she stood there for a while, sniffling and wiping her eyes, before finally walking away. For weeks, I kept expecting her to show up again. I considered changing my address, but since I used my home as my office, it wasn't a practical option. Fortunately, she never came back. 2 months later, I swiped right on someone new. This time, the experience was completely different. There were no misleading photos, no bizarre stories, no uninvited visits to my front door. Just genuine conversation, mutual respect, and the beginnings of something real. That woman is now my wife. I met her on a balmy October evening in 2023, the kind of night where the city felt alive with possibility. She was charming, smart, and quick with her wit, a rare combination. After days of chatting, I decided to take her to 28 HK Street, a spot known for its intimate vibe and craft cocktails. It felt like the perfect place to kick off what I hoped could be something meaningful. From the moment she walked in, I could feel the chemistry. The conversation flowed effortlessly, full of laughter and the kind of banter that makes you forget the world outside. We talked about everything: our favorite books, wild travel stories, and even the strangest pizza toppings we'd ever tried. By the end of the night, it was clear we had something special. As we hugged goodbye, I found myself genuinely excited. I didn't just like her, I could see potential. I started making plans in my head: pizza-making classes, a board game night, maybe even a weekend hike. When she said she couldn't wait to see me again, I believed her. The next morning, I woke up smiling, already drafting a text to check in. But when I sent it, there was no reply. Hours turned into days, and still nothing. My excitement turned into confusion, then into a sinking realization. I'd been ghosted. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was busy. Maybe something had come up. But deep down, I knew the truth. She wasn't interested. It stung, but I told myself I'd done my part. I'd put myself out there, and if she didn't see the value in that, it was her loss. So I moved on. Or at least I tried to. On the fourth day, just when I thought I'd finally put the whole thing behind me, my phone buzzed with a message from her. "Hey, I owe you an explanation," it began. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the message. What followed was a confession that turned my confusion into outright disbelief. She admitted she was attached, in a relationship. She and her boyfriend had been going through a rough patch, and I had been a rebound. "I wanted to see if I could feel something again," she wrote. "I'm so sorry. It wasn't fair to you." Fair? That was an understatement. What baffled me more was what came next. "Because you paid for the date," she said, "I'd like to treat you as a way to repay you. We can meet again, no strings attached." I stared at my phone, her words swimming before my eyes. Was she seriously suggesting another meeting, as if my time and effort could be squared away like a bank transfer? I took a deep breath, my frustration simmering just below the surface. I told her I appreciated the gesture, but that it was better to end things here. I was upset, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She apologized profusely, her words dripping with regret. I told her it was fine, and for the second time, I resolved to move on. Fast forward to last week. After taking a break from dating, I decided to dip my toes back in the pool. I downloaded Bumble, refreshed my profile, and started swiping. It felt good, hopeful even. And then I saw her. Her profile photo was unmistakable, that same radiant smile I'd fallen for back in October. For a moment, I froze, caught between disbelief and morbid curiosity. Against my better judgment, I clicked on her profile, scrolling through her bio. And that's when I saw it. Deal breakers, married/attached men. I laughed out loud, a sharp, bitter sound that startled even me. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. Here was the woman who had ghosted me, confessed to being attached, and used me as a rebound, now proclaiming her moral standards to the world. The hypocrisy was almost comical. Almost. For a second, I considered messaging her. A part of me wanted to call her out, to point out the glaring contradiction between her actions and her words. But what good would that do? It wouldn't erase the disappointment of our first date or undo the hurt she'd caused. It would only drag me back into a situation I had no interest in revisiting. Instead, I swiped left, closing the chapter once and for all. Dating, they say, is supposed to be an adventure. At best, it's a journey toward connection, laughter, and shared dreams. At worst, it's a series of awkward encounters that you laugh about later. I've had my fair share of both, but a few dates stand out in my memory, not for their charm or romance, but for the sheer absurdity of it all. Take the first woman, for example. Let's call her Sarah. We'd been chatting for a while before we decided to meet up, and our first few dates went well. She was smart, funny, and seemed refreshingly straightforward. But things started to unravel by date 5. It began with what seemed like a small misunderstanding. We'd planned to meet for dinner, and her office was just 5 minutes away from the restaurant. I figured it made sense for us to meet there, especially since she'd been so insistent on keeping things fair, splitting the bill on every date, never letting me pay more than my share. I admired her independence, so I didn't think twice about it, but when I arrived at the restaurant, I could tell something was off. She was already seated, arms crossed, her smile notably absent. "You didn't offer to pick me up," she said, her tone sharp. I blinked, caught off guard. I thought since it's so close. She cut me off with a dismissive wave. It's the principle, not the distance. The evening went downhill from there. By the end of the meal, her irritation had simmered into a cold, distant politeness. A few days later, she ended things, her reasoning as baffling as the rest of it. I need someone who's willing to fight for me, she said, her voice dripping with finality. You never even tried to insist on paying the bill. I stood there, dumbfounded. Was this a test? Some kind of secret code I was supposed to crack? I never found out. Then there was the woman who, halfway through a pleasant lunch date, dragged me into a high-end boutique. Let's call her Emily. We'd just finished our meal, and I thought things were going well, until she suddenly stopped in front of a Furla store, her eyes lighting up like a kid in a candy shop. Without a word, she walked in, gesturing for me to follow. Look at this one, she said, holding up a sleek black handbag. Isn't it gorgeous? It was. But before I could respond, she added, You'd look so good carrying this for me. I laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking. Yeah, it's nice. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Well, what? Aren't you going to offer to get it for me? I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. She wasn't joking. Her smile faltered as the silence stretched between us. I don't think that's appropriate, I said carefully. Her expression soured immediately. Without another word, she put the bag back on the shelf and stormed out of the store, leaving me standing there like an idiot. Needless to say, I never heard from her again. But the strangest date of all, the one that still makes me question reality, was with a woman I'll call Kate. We'd agreed to meet for coffee, and things started out normal enough. She was warm, engaging, and had a sharp wit that I found refreshing. But then, out of nowhere, she dropped a bombshell. So let's talk about kinks, she said, her tone casual, as if she were suggesting we discuss our favorite movies. I nearly choked on my coffee. Kinks? I repeated, caught completely off guard. Yeah, she said, leaning in with an eager glint in her eye. I think it's important to be upfront about these things. For example, I like being slapped. I stared at her, unsure if I'd misheard. Slapped? Full force, she clarified. Across the face. My mind scrambled for an appropriate response. Was this a test? Some kind of icebreaker I didn't understand? But she wasn't finished. My dad used to do it, she said matter-of-factly, and I guess it kind of stuck with me. The air left the room. My coffee cup hovered mid-air as I tried to process what she'd just said. Was she being serious? Was this a joke? Or some twisted attempt at vulnerability? I don't think I can relate to that, I managed to say, my voice shaking slightly. She shrugged, completely unbothered. Fair enough. But hey, at least I'm honest. I sat there, stunned, unsure if I was part of some elaborate prank, or if this was genuinely her idea of first date conversation. To this day, I still don't know. I wasn't looking for anything serious. A simple coffee date, a chance to meet someone new, maybe even spark a connection. That's all I wanted when I met her. Let's call her Emma. We'd exchanged a few messages online, nothing too intense, but enough to convince me she was worth meeting in person. She was funny, quick-witted, and had this charmingly blunt way of talking that felt refreshing. So when she suggested grabbing coffee at a little cafe downtown, I thought, why not? That afternoon, the weather was perfect, crisp, sunny, the kind of day that makes you feel like anything is possible. I arrived a few minutes early, ordered a black coffee, and chose a table by the window. When Emma walked in, she was exactly how I imagined, confident, smiling, and effortlessly cool. I couldn't have known that by the end of the date, she'd be telling me my destiny. Things started off well enough. We talked about the usual first date stuff, work, hobbies, favorite shows. She was animated, gesturing wildly as she described her latest obsession with some obscure crime documentary. I found myself relaxing, enjoying the easy flow of conversation. At one point, the topic shifted to past relationships. It wasn't anything heavy, just a natural progression of getting to know each other. She asked how many relationships I'd been in, and I answered honestly. Just one, I said, taking a sip of coffee. It lasted 7 years. Her eyes widened slightly, and she leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. 7 years? That's a long time. Yeah, I said, shrugging. We were together through most of my 20s. It didn't work out in the end, but we stayed on good terms. She's a great person. Emma nodded thoughtfully, her expression unreadable. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to curiosity. But then she asked a question I hadn't been expecting. Why aren't you still together? I hesitated. It wasn't a question I'd had to answer often, mostly because I rarely talked about my ex on dates. But Emma's tone wasn't accusatory, just genuinely curious. So I gave her the short version. We grew apart, I said simply. Wanted different things. It was mutual. She tilted her head, her brow furrowing, as if I'd just told her something incomprehensible. But you were together for 7 years. Yeah, I said slowly, unsure where she was going with this. That's a long time, but it doesn't mean it was meant to last forever. Emma leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. I don't know, she said, her tone turning serious. 7 years? That's not just some fling. That's destiny. I blinked. Destiny? She nodded, her expression solemn now. You don't spend 7 years with someone unless they're your soulmate. You need to get back together with her. For a moment, I thought she was joking. I even let out a nervous laugh, waiting for her to crack a smile or say, just kidding. But she didn't. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with conviction. Emma, I said, setting my coffee cup down, I don't think you understand. We broke up for a reason. It's been a couple of years. She's moved on. I've moved on. She shook her head, leaning forward again. No, you haven't. Not really. You can't move on from something like that. It's fate. You're supposed to be with her. I was at a loss for words. How do you respond to someone who's decided they know your life better than you do? Look, I said carefully, I appreciate your perspective, but I'm pretty sure I know my own destiny better than anyone else. She ignored me, her voice gaining momentum. No, listen to me. You're wasting your time dating other people. She's the one for you. You need to stop all of this, these apps, these dates, and go find her. Fight for her. I stared at her, my brain struggling to process what was happening. Was this real? Was I actually sitting in a coffee shop with a woman who, just 30 minutes ago, had been laughing about crime documentaries, and now she was lecturing me about my supposed soulmate? Emma, I said, trying to keep my tone calm, I don't think you understand how relationships work. Just because you're with someone for a long time doesn't mean it's meant to be forever. Her eyes narrowed. But what if it was? What if you gave up too soon? What if she's sitting somewhere right now, waiting for you to come back? I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, grabbing my coat. I think we're done here, I said, my voice clipped. She looked surprised, almost offended. You're leaving? Yes, I said firmly. Because this isn't a conversation, it's a lecture. And frankly, I don't need a stranger telling me who I'm supposed to love. As I walked out of the cafe, my head was spinning. What had just happened? How had a simple coffee date turned into an impromptu intervention? The audacity of it all was staggering. By the time I got home, I was still replaying the conversation in my mind. It was absurd, laughable even, but there was a part of me that couldn't shake the strangeness of it all. Who does that? Who meets someone for the first time and decides to play matchmaker with their ex? The next day, I received a message from Emma. I really hope you think about what I said. It read, you deserve to be happy. With her. I blocked her immediately. I met him at a dimly lit pub, the kind of place where the music is just loud enough to drown out your better judgment. He was charming in a rugged, rough-around-the-edges way, the kind of guy who made you feel like the most fascinating person in the room. His stories were wild, his laugh infectious. When he invited me back to his place, I hesitated, but only for a moment. I told myself it was part of the adventure, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited behind his front door. His apartment was the polar opposite of his charisma. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt the air shift. It wasn't just messy, it was chaos frozen in time. Clothes were strewn everywhere, dishes piled high in the sink, and a faint, stale odor hung in the air. But I convinced myself to look past it. People can be messy, right? Besides, it wasn't like I'd come here expecting a 5-star experience. Make yourself comfortable, he said, motioning toward a couch that had definitely seen better days. I've got something I want to show you. Before I could respond, he disappeared into another room. I sat down gingerly, trying not to think about what might be lurking between the cushions. The minutes dragged on, the sound of drawers opening and closing breaking the silence. When he finally returned, he was holding something in his hands. A stack of papers, worn and yellowed at the edges, tied together with a frayed piece of string. I want to share this with you, he said, his voice softer now, almost reverent. It's my poetry. Now, I like poetry as much as the next person. But when he added, I wrote it while I was in Mountjoy, my stomach did a little flip. Mountjoy, as in the prison. Mountjoy? I echoed, trying to keep my tone neutral. Yeah, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I did some time there. Long story. But these poems, they got me through it. He sat down across from me, untying the string with care, as if unwrapping a sacred relic. He handed me the first page, his eyes watching mine intently as I read. The words were raw, heavy with anger and regret. They were scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting, like they'd been ripped straight from his soul. "It's intense," I said, handing the page back. "Prison changes you," he replied, his gaze distant now. "Makes you see the world differently. You want to hear one?" Before I could answer, he started reciting, his voice low and gravelly, each word punctuated with emotion. It was haunting, beautiful in its way, but also deeply unsettling. By the time he finished, I was struggling to figure out how to respond. But before I could come up with something diplomatic, he clapped his hands together and grinned. "You need a drink," he said, jumping up and heading for the kitchen. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, glancing around the room. That's when I noticed the faint but unmistakable stench growing stronger. My eyes wandered toward the small hallway, leading to what I assumed was the bathroom. Curiosity got the better of me. I stood, taking a tentative step toward the hallway. The closer I got, the more potent the smell became. It wasn't just bad. It was foul, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes and lingers in your nostrils. When I finally peeked into the bathroom, my stomach turned. The toilet had no door. None. Just an open, doorless frame leading into a space that could generously be described as a health hazard. And on the wall, God help me, there was something smeared there. Brown, unmistakable. My mind rebelled against the obvious conclusion, but there was no denying it. Shit! On the wall. I froze, a mix of horror and disbelief washing over me. This wasn't just a messy apartment. This was a nightmare. "What do you think?" His voice called from the other room, startling me. "The poetry, I mean." I turned back toward the living room, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's unique," I managed to say, my throat dry. "Really powerful." He appeared in the hallway, holding two mismatched glasses filled with some unidentifiable liquid. He noticed where I was standing, his expression shifting slightly. "Oh yeah," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Meant to get that fixed." "Fixed? Fixed? That wasn't something you fix. That was something you burned, cleansed, and exorcised." I realized then and there that I needed to leave. Immediately. I just remembered. "I've got an early morning tomorrow," I blurted out, edging toward the door. "I should probably get going." He looked disappointed, but didn't argue. "All right," he said, handing me one of the glasses anyway. "At least have a sip before you go." I didn't. Instead, I set the glass down on the nearest surface, muttered a quick thanks for the poetry, and bolted out the door before he could say anything else. The moment I stepped outside, the fresh air hit me like a blessing. As I walked home, the absurdity of the night started to sink in. The prison poetry, the toilet without a door, the wall. It was almost too much to process. By the time I reached my apartment, I was laughing, partly out of relief, partly out of disbelief. But when I matched with Ryan on Tinder a few years ago, it felt like I'd struck gold. He was handsome in a way that made you do a double take, sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that could probably sell you anything. More than that, he was funny and charming. The kind of guy who had you checking your phone constantly, grinning at every notification. When he asked me out, I didn't hesitate. "We'll grab food," he said. Simple, straightforward, low pressure. Perfect. On the day of the date, he even drove an hour to pick me up. I remember seeing him step out of the car, and he was even more striking in person. His confidence was magnetic, and as we drove, the conversation flowed effortlessly. I found myself thinking, wow, he's the real deal. That optimism lasted until he mentioned a barbecue. "It's just a quick stop," he said casually, flashing me a smile. "Some of my friends are having a barbecue. You don't mind, do you?" I hesitated. Meeting someone's friends on a first date wasn't exactly what I'd signed up for, but I didn't want to seem uptight. "Sure," I said, trying to sound breezy. "A quick stop sounds fine." As we pulled up to a large, beautiful house, my unease grew. The driveway was packed with cars, and the sound of music and laughter spilled out into the street. "This doesn't look like just a few friends," I said, glancing at him. He laughed. "Yeah, it's my sister's engagement party." I stared at him, stunned. "You're taking me to a family event? On our first date?" "It'll be fun," he said, already getting out of the car. Before I could protest, he was at my door, gesturing for me to follow. The moment we stepped inside, I realized I was in way over my head. The house was packed. people milling about in every room, drinks in hand, laughter echoing off the walls. Ryan introduced me to person after person, barely giving me time to process their names. His parents, his uncles, cousins, neighbors, I lost track. Then, before I knew it, I was face to face with his mom and grandmother. "Oh, you're the girl Ryan's been talking about," his mom said, smiling warmly. "It's so nice to meet you." My stomach sank. What has he been saying? "Lovely to meet you," I managed to say, forcing a smile while my brain screamed, "I don't even know this guy." Meanwhile, Ryan had disappeared into the crowd, leaving me alone with his family. I made polite small talk, trying not to look like a deer in headlights, but the absurdity of the situation was sinking in fast. It wasn't long before things spiraled even further. Ryan, now several drinks in, was off with his friends, completely ignoring me. His family, however, was all too eager to include me in the festivities. By the time I spotted him again, we were all heading to the local pub for the after-party. I thought about slipping away, calling for a ride, but I felt trapped. Everyone was so friendly, and leaving without an explanation felt rude. So I went along, telling myself this would all be over soon. The pub was chaos. Drinks were flowing, a live band was playing, and the energy was wild. And that's when things hit their peak. His grandmother, yes, his grandmother, climbed onto the bar. To the sound of Zombie by the Cranberries, she danced like she was living her best life, the crowd cheering her on. I'll admit, for a moment, I forgot how insane the night was and just stood there, laughing in disbelief. Then I saw her, Ryan's ex-girlfriend. She spotted me from across the room, her eyes narrowing like a hawk locking onto its prey. She marched over, drink in hand, and leaned in close, her voice sharp. "So, you're the homewrecker," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Excuse me?" I said, blinking in confusion. She didn't hold back, launching into a tirade about how Ryan was hers, how I had no business being there, and how I was clearly trying to ruin her life. I was too stunned to respond. "Homewrecker? I just met this guy." By the time Ryan stumbled over to intervene, the damage was done. His ex stormed off, leaving me standing there, humiliated and furious. Ryan, oblivious to the chaos he'd caused, slurred something incoherent, and then dropped the biggest bombshell of the night. "I love you," he said, swaying slightly as he grabbed my arm. "I've never felt this way about anyone." Before I could respond, he doubled over and vomited. On my shoes. That was the breaking point. I didn't care how handsome he was, or how charming he'd seemed in our messages. I didn't care that his family was lovely, or that his grandmother had just delivered the performance of the century. I was done. I pulled out my phone and called a friend, begging them to pick me up. As I waited outside, Ryan tried to follow me, mumbling apologies and asking if I wanted to come back to his place. I ignored him, keeping my distance until my friend's car pulled up. "Is that him?" my friend asked as I climbed into the passenger seat, motioning toward Ryan, who was now sitting on the curb, looking pitiful. "Yep," I said, slamming the door. "Drive." The next day I deleted Tinder. I didn't block Ryan, but I never responded to his follow-up messages. Every time I thought about that night, the engagement party, the ex, the declaration of love, the vomit, I couldn't help but cringe. It was one of those early spring evenings, where the air had just a hint of warmth, teasing the promise of summer. The kind of evening that made me feel hopeful, maybe even optimistic. I had met him on a dating app a few weeks earlier. His profile was unremarkable, but his messages were charming enough, witty, quick responses that made me think, why not give this a chance? But from the moment we met, something felt off. We'd agreed on a walk, something casual and low pressure. When I arrived, he was already there, leaning against a bench with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His grin was easy, confident, as he greeted me with a quick once-over. "You look great," he said, his voice smooth but lacking sincerity. "So, where are we eating?" The question caught me off guard. "Eating?" I repeated. "Yeah," he said, already turning as if the matter was settled. "I'm starving. Let's grab something." I hesitated. It wasn't that I minded grabbing a bite, but the assumption grated on me. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe he was nervous, or maybe he'd misread the vibe of our plans. Either way, I figured I'd go along with it, for now. We found a small cafe, the kind with cozy booths and menus that tried too hard to be fancy. As we sat down, he didn't bother opening his menu. Instead, he scanned mine over my shoulder, pointing out the most expensive options. "Go ahead," he said, grinning. "You can get me the steak." I froze, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "Excuse me?" "I didn't bring any money," he said, his tone casual, as if this were a completely normal thing to admit. But don't worry, I'll pay you back later. I stared at him, the first stirrings of annoyance bubbling in my chest. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment situation where he'd forgotten his wallet. He'd planned this, deliberately, but against my better judgment, I nodded. The waiter came, and he ordered the steak, medium rare, with an expensive cocktail to match. I stuck to something simple, my appetite waning under the weight of my irritation. The meal was awkward. He talked endlessly, mostly about himself, barely stopping to ask me a single question. When the food arrived, he barely acknowledged my presence, too busy devouring his steak with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't eaten in days. When the check came, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting for me to pick it up. I paid without a word, my frustration simmering just below the surface. I told myself I'd end the night soon, make up some excuse to leave. But then he dropped the next bombshell. "Can you lend me 20 euros?" he asked as we stepped outside, his tone so casual it made my head spin. "What?" I said, stopping in my tracks. "Why?" "I've got a few things I need to pick up tomorrow," he said, shrugging. "I'll pay you back. Promise." I should have said no. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to walk away, to cut my losses and never look back. But instead, I sighed and handed over the money, more out of disbelief than anything else. "Thanks," he said, slipping the bill into his pocket without so much as a thank you. "You're really generous, you know that?" By this point, I was done. I just wanted to go home, crawl into bed, and pretend this date had never happened. But, of course, it wasn't that simple. As we walked toward the nearest bus stop, he glanced at me again. "You wouldn't happen to have bus fare, would you?" he asked. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at him in disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Come on," he said, grinning like this was all some big joke. "It's not like I'm asking for much." I bit back a sharp retort, shaking my head. "I'm getting a taxi," I said firmly. "It'll pass your house. I'll drop you off." What happened next took this nightmare of a date to a whole new level. He stopped walking, his face suddenly serious. "Why do you want to know where I live?" I blinked at him, completely thrown. "What? Is that your plan?" he asked, his voice rising. "You're trying to find out where I live, aren't you?" The accusation hit me like a slap, leaving me momentarily speechless. "Are you kidding me?" I said finally, my voice sharp. "I'm offering to help you get home." "That's it." He crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "Seems suspicious," he muttered. At that moment, I realized I wasn't dealing with someone who was merely inconsiderate or thoughtless. This was something else entirely: paranoia, entitlement, maybe even a touch of delusion. Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. "You know what?" I said, taking a step back. "Forget it. Find your own way home." Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked away, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and relief. Behind me, I heard him call out, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. The taxi ride home was blissfully quiet, the soft hum of the engine soothing my frayed nerves. As I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, disbelief, and a simmering anger at myself for letting the date go on as long as it had. The next day, when I recounted the story to a friend, she couldn't stop laughing. "You actually gave him 20 euros, she said, doubling over. "What were you thinking?" "I wasn't," I admitted. "But hey, at least I've got a story." I should have known from the start that this night was going to take a bizarre turn. Maybe it was the way he confidently poured milk into a glass of whiskey, swirling the concoction with the kind of flourish usually reserved for fine cocktails. He looked at me over the rim of the glass, a crooked grin on his face, as if daring me to judge him. "That's an interesting choice," I said, trying to keep the judgment out of my voice. He laughed, taking a long sip. "Trust me, it's good." Spoiler, it wasn't. But at that moment, I convinced myself it was just one of those harmless quirks, something that might make a good story to tell my friends later. I wasn't prepared for what the morning had in store. The night itself was unremarkable. We'd met at a bar, his confidence catching my attention in a way that felt refreshing, if not a little reckless. After a few drinks and some easy conversation, he invited me back to his place. It wasn't the kind of offer I usually accepted, but something about his crooked smile and casual charm made me say yes. His apartment was about what I expected: mismatched furniture, dishes piled in the sink, and a faint musty smell that clung to the air. But I wasn't there to critique his housekeeping. We spent the night talking, laughing, and eventually drifting into a fitful sleep on his lumpy mattress. Morning came too soon. At 7 a.m. sharp, I woke to the sound of his alarm blaring. He groaned, rolled over, and promptly ignored it, leaving me wide awake in the unfamiliar room. After a few minutes of lying there, contemplating my life choices, he finally stirred. "You should come with me today," he said groggily, propping himself up on one elbow. I blinked at him, confused. "Come with you where?" "To work," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It'll be fun." I raised an eyebrow. "Fun? Washing dishes in a kitchen?" "Yeah, why not?" He grinned, his enthusiasm bizarrely genuine. "It's not as bad as it sounds. You'll get free food." I laughed, assuming he was joking, but the look on his face told me he wasn't. I mumbled something about needing to get home, but he wasn't letting it go. He leaned closer, his voice taking on a strange, almost pleading tone. "Come on," he said. "It'll be a good time." I needed an escape, and fast. "Let me just use the bathroom," I said, sliding out of bed before he could protest. The bathroom door was just a few steps away, but the moment I opened it, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing in all his glory, was a man, completely naked, brush in hand, painting the bathroom door. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. The man, clearly in his 60s, turned to look at me without a hint of shame or surprise, his expression calm and focused. "Morning," he said casually, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I gawked at him, my brain scrambling to catch up. This wasn't just any man. This was his father, painting the bathroom door. Naked. At 7 in the morning. I didn't know what to do. My fight-or-flight instincts were warring with each other, leaving me frozen in the doorway. The smell of paint thinner filled the small bathroom, adding to the surrealness of the scene. "I'll be done in a minute," his dad said, turning back to his work with the same nonchalant demeanor. I muttered something incoherent and backed away, closing the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I could feel the beginnings of hysterical laughter bubbling up in my chest. I needed to get out of there, immediately. When I returned to the bedroom, he was still lounging in bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up at me, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding in the next room. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual. I opened my mouth to tell him about the naked man painting the bathroom door, but stopped myself. What was the point? Instead, I forced a smile. "I think I'm gonna head out." He frowned. "Really? But I thought you might." No, I interrupted, grabbing my things as quickly as possible. "I've got a lot to do today. Thanks for everything." He didn't press the issue, just shrugged and nodded. I was halfway out the door before he could change his mind. As I stepped outside, the crisp morning air hit me like a wake-up call. I walked briskly down the street, trying to process what had just happened. The milk and whiskey guy. The dishwashing job invitation. The naked father painting at dawn. By the time I reached the corner, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I burst out laughing, the sound echoing down the empty street. It was ridiculous, absurd, the kind of story that felt too strange to be real. But it was. Later, when I told my friends about the encounter, they were in hysterics, begging for every detail. "Why didn't you just leave when he poured the milk and whiskey?" one of them asked, tears streaming down her face. "I thought that was the red flag," I said. "Turns out it was just the appetizer." I should have known from the start that this night was going to take a bizarre turn. Maybe it was the way he confidently poured milk into a glass of whiskey, swirling the concoction with the kind of flourish usually reserved for fine cocktails. He looked at me over the rim of the glass, a crooked grin on his face, as if daring me to judge him. "That's an interesting choice," I said, trying to keep the judgment out of my voice. He laughed, taking a long sip. "Trust me, it's good." Spoiler, it wasn't. But at that moment, I convinced myself it was just one of those harmless quirks, something that might make a good story to tell my friends later. I wasn't prepared for what the morning had in store. The night itself was unremarkable. We'd met at a bar, his confidence catching my attention in a way that felt refreshing, if not a little reckless. After a few drinks and some easy conversation, he invited me back to his place. It wasn't the kind of offer I usually accepted, but something about his crooked smile and casual charm made me say yes. His apartment was about what I expected: mismatched furniture, dishes piled in the sink, and a faint musty smell that clung to the air. But I wasn't there to critique his housekeeping. We spent the night talking, laughing, and eventually drifting into a fitful sleep on his lumpy mattress. Morning came too soon. At 7 a.m. sharp, I woke to the sound of his alarm blaring. He groaned, rolled over, and promptly ignored it, leaving me wide awake in the unfamiliar room. After a few minutes of lying there, contemplating my life choices, he finally stirred. "You should come with me today," he said groggily, propping himself up on one elbow. I blinked at him, confused. "Come with you where?" "To work," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It'll be fun." I raised an eyebrow. "Fun? Washing dishes in a kitchen?" "Yeah, why not?" He grinned, his enthusiasm bizarrely genuine. "It's not as bad as it sounds. You'll get free food." I laughed, assuming he was joking, but the look on his face told me he wasn't. I mumbled something about needing to get home, but he wasn't letting it go. He leaned closer, his voice taking on a strange, almost pleading tone. "Come on," he said. "It'll be a good time." I needed an escape, and fast. "Let me just use the bathroom," I said, sliding out of bed before he could protest. The bathroom door was just a few steps away, but the moment I opened it, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing in all his glory, was a man, completely naked, brush in hand, painting the bathroom door. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. The man, clearly in his 60s, turned to look at me without a hint of shame or surprise, his expression calm and focused. "Morning," he said casually, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. I gawked at him, my brain scrambling to catch up. This wasn't just any man. This was his father, painting the bathroom door. Naked. At 7 in the morning. I didn't know what to do. My fight-or-flight instincts were warring with each other, leaving me frozen in the doorway. The smell of paint thinner filled the small bathroom, adding to the surrealness of the scene. "I'll be done in a minute," his dad said, turning back to his work with the same nonchalant demeanor. I muttered something incoherent and backed away, closing the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I could feel the beginnings of hysterical laughter bubbling up in my chest. I needed to get out of there, immediately. When I returned to the bedroom, he was still lounging in bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up at me, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding in the next room. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual. I opened my mouth to tell him about the naked man painting the bathroom door, but stopped myself. What was the point? Instead, I forced a smile. "I think I'm gonna head out." He frowned. "Really? But I thought you might." No, I interrupted, grabbing my things as quickly as possible. "I've got a lot to do today. Thanks for everything." He didn't press the issue, just shrugged and nodded. I was halfway out the door before he could change his mind. As I stepped outside, the crisp morning air hit me like a wake-up call. I walked briskly down the street, trying to process what had just happened. The milk and whiskey guy. The dishwashing job invitation. The naked father painting at dawn. By the time I reached the corner, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I burst out laughing, the sound echoing down the empty street. It was ridiculous, absurd, the kind of story that felt too strange to be real. But it was. Later, when I told my friends about the encounter, they were in hysterics, begging for every detail. "Why didn't you just leave when he poured the milk and whiskey?" one of them asked, tears streaming down her face. "I thought that was the red flag," I said. "Turns out it was just the appetizer." Picture this. I'm sprawled on my couch, half-heartedly scrolling through Tinder, while some Netflix show I've seen twice drones on in the background. Swipe left, swipe left, swipe left, nothing worth stopping for. I'm about to give up when I see her. She has one of those perfectly imperfect smiles, like she knows a secret joke, but might share it if you're lucky. Her bio reads, "Professional pizza enthusiast. Certified blanket fort builder." It's quirky but not trying too hard. Something about her feels different. Different sounded good that night. Different sounded like exactly what I needed. Now, I'm not the type to throw out some generic "hey" as an opener. I spend a solid 5 minutes crafting the perfect message. It had to be clever but not too much, playful without coming off as desperate. Finally, I settle on, "Do you believe in love at first swipe, or should I message you again?" I hit send and immediately start overthinking it. But to my surprise, she replies, and not with some half-hearted response. She matches my energy, joke for joke, and suddenly we're talking about everything. Our mutual hatred of celery, our love of trashy reality TV, even the obscure bands we both pretended to know way too much about. I couldn't believe how easy it was to talk to her. This never happens, right? Except it was happening. That's when my inner sleuth kicked in. See, I've watched enough Catfish to know better than to take someone at face value online. So like any responsible millennial, I did a little digging. It wasn't creepy, I'm not talking about hiring a private investigator or anything, but I Googled her name and tried to find her on social media. That's when I hit my first roadblock. She didn't have a Facebook. At all. I mean, who doesn't have Facebook? I casually brought it up during one of our chats, and she just laughed. "Oh, I never use it," she said. Fair enough, I thought. Some people are off the grid. But something about it didn't sit right. I asked for her last name, just to see if it would lead anywhere. And that's when suddenly she did have a Facebook. The profile was sketchy as hell. No posts older than a week, only 5 photos total, and all of them looked like stock images of a girl living her best life. Her name sounded straight out of a spy movie. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a scam. But then she sent me this goofy meme about pizza toppings, and my brain went, she can't be that bad, right? I convinced myself to let it go. She was probably just weird, and weird wasn't necessarily bad. So when she suggested meeting up, I agreed. She picked a bar halfway between where she said she lived and where I lived. It seemed like a reasonable choice, public, busy, and neutral ground. But as I was driving there, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I was walking into a setup. My overactive imagination painted a vivid picture. I'd walk in, and instead of meeting her, I'd get jumped by some sketchy group of Russian dudes she was working with. Just to be safe, I stopped at an ATM on the way and deposited all my cash. It felt a little paranoid, but I wasn't about to take chances. When I got to the bar, there she was. She looked just like her profile pictures, and for a second, all my doubts melted away. She smiled, waved, and even gave me a quick hug. Everything seemed fine, until she said, "This place is a little crowded. Let's go somewhere else." It felt like a trap. Who changes locations on a first date? But she was already heading for the door, and I didn't want to seem rude. As we walked to the next bar, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting a gang of thugs to jump out of the shadows. Nothing happened. We made it to the second bar, got a couple of drinks, and sat down to talk. At first, I was still on edge. Every part of me screamed, "Be suspicious." But as the conversation flowed, I started to relax. She was funny, sharp, and just the right amount of weird. We talked for hours, about everything from travel plans to our favorite childhood cartoons. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd misjudged her. And then she brought up pizza. "There's this amazing pizza place across the street," she said. Her eyes lit up as she described it, and I couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. By then I was a little tipsy, so when she suggested going, I agreed. But as we were leaving the bar, she suddenly stopped and said, "Actually, let's go somewhere else. There's an even better pizza place, like 15 blocks away." 15 blocks. It was freezing outside, and I wasn't exactly dressed for a hike. But she had this infectious energy, like this pizza place was going to change my life. Against my better judgment, I followed her. By the time we got there, I couldn't feel my fingers or toes, and I was starting to wonder if she was messing with me. The pizza? It was fine. Not life-changing. Not even great. Just pizza. I didn't say anything, though, because she seemed genuinely happy about it. After we ate, she suggested hitting one more bar. I should have said no. I should have gone home. But for some reason, I said yes. At the third bar, the conversation took a deeper turn. She told me she'd just gotten out of a 4-year relationship, like days before we matched on Tinder. I could tell it was still fresh for her, and while part of me wanted to run, another part wanted to stay. She was messy, sure, but there was something about her I couldn't walk away from. At one point, she leaned in and kissed me. My brain immediately started panicking. This was way too fast, wasn't it? I barely knew her, and the night had been a roller coaster of suspicion and surprise. But something about the way she smiled at me afterward made me think, maybe this is worth it. When the night ended, I was sure I'd never hear from her again. It felt too weird, too chaotic. But the next morning, she texted me, "Last night was fun. Let's do it again sometime." That was a year ago. She wasn't a spy or a scammer, just a delightfully weird person who didn't care about following anyone's rules but her own. Since then, we've been inseparable. Every now and then, I bring up all the red flags I had to ignore to keep dating her, and she just laughs. "You didn't have to follow me to that second pizza place," she teases. But honestly, I'd follow her anywhere, even if it's 15 blocks in the freezing cold for mediocre pizza. Let me set the scene. I'm a stressed out, overworked college student in need of some kind of social distraction when Tinder first came onto the scene. Back then, it wasn't the meme-laden wasteland it's sometimes known for now. It felt shiny, new, and promising. You'd swipe match, and maybe, just maybe, you'd hit the jackpot and meet someone who didn't start every sentence with WID. That's exactly what happened when I matched with her. Let's call her Bae. She was a paramedic, and her bio was like a magnet for my attention. Sharp, funny, and so real it practically screamed this is not a drill. For once, I wasn't nervous about opening the conversation. She seemed cool, and I threw out something playful. To my surprise, she responded right away. From there, the messages flew back and forth. I was quick-witted and hilarious, the kind of person who could turn any mundane story into a full-blown comedy special. We bonded over everything, the absurdity of our schedules, her paramedic shifts, my school and work chaos, the misery of waking up before the sun, and our shared appreciation for memes so bad they looped back around to being genius. Over the days we chatted, I found myself actually looking forward to hearing that little notification ding on my phone. This felt different. She had a thing, though. Playfully, but also a little too often, she'd ask, "You're not sketchy, are you? You don't have a rap sheet or some weird secret life?" It was clearly a joke, but there was a thread of truth in it. She admitted she had a bit of a type, and unfortunately for her, that type often included guys with bad habits and worse judgment. I laughed it off and reassured her that no, I was not a closet criminal, just a caffeine-fueled student trying to make it through the week without imploding. We'd been chatting for almost a week when we set a date to finally meet up. It wasn't going to be anything wild, just a chill coffee hang after one of her shifts. I was psyched. There was just one more weekend shift to get through, and then I'd meet the girl who had somehow made Tinder feel like something more than a swipe factory. 2 nights before the big meetup, though, fate decided to mess with me in the worst way imaginable. I was walking to a buddy's house for a low-key beer and hangout night when 2 guys jumped me out of nowhere. I didn't even see them coming. 1 second I was texting my friend to say I was almost there. The next, I was being shoved against a wall, fists grabbing at my jacket and neck. The gold chain I wore, the only bit of jewelry I owned, and one I probably should have left at home, caught their attention immediately. I wasn't about to hand it over without a fight. Bad decision? Absolutely. They didn't just want the chain, they wanted my rings too. I lashed out, struggling against them, adrenaline doing its best to keep me upright. Somewhere in the chaos, one of them pulled a knife. I didn't feel the stab at first. I just felt the force of the blow to the back of my head, like someone had hit me with a metal pipe. It wasn't until I stumbled back and touched my neck that I felt the blood. A lot of blood. Oh, and as if the situation couldn't get any worse, the small bag of weed in my jacket pocket spilled out during the scuffle. I hadn't even remembered it was there. So there I was, sitting on the sidewalk, bleeding out of a gash in my skull, surrounded by my own spilled stash and the lingering echo of my attacker's retreating footsteps. I was still sitting there in a haze of shock, blood dripping down my neck and pooling around me, when I heard the sirens. Somebody had called for an ambulance, which, great, because I wasn't in the mood to bleed out on the street that night. My vision was blurry, and my head throbbed like I'd been hit with a sledgehammer. All I wanted was to get patched up, go home, and bury myself under a mountain of blankets. The ambulance pulled up, and the doors swung open. That's when I saw her. It was out of all the ambulances in a city of 3 million people, of course it had to be hers. I blinked, trying to process what was happening, but there was no mistaking her. She froze for a split second, staring at me like she couldn't believe it either. Then, like a pro, she snapped into paramedic mode and got to work. "Hey," she said, her voice sharp but professional. "You're bleeding pretty bad. Let's get you on the stretcher." All I could think was, oh my God, I'm bleeding out, and this is the most embarrassing moment of my life. I mean, what were the odds? What kind of sick cosmic joke was this? The girl I'd been texting for a week, who thought it was hilarious to ask if I was sketchy or had a criminal past, was now face to face with me in the most suspicious-looking situation imaginable. I tried to explain as they loaded me into the ambulance, but honestly, there wasn't much I could say. The blood, the knife wound, the scattered weed on the ground. It didn't exactly scream, innocent victim. To her credit, she stayed professional the whole ride, but I could feel the awkward tension radiating off of her. We recognized each other immediately, but she didn't acknowledge it beyond a tight-lipped, barely there nod. The ride felt like an eternity. She patched me up as best she could, her movements precise and practiced, but I could feel the judgment. Or maybe I was projecting. Either way, the humiliation was unbearable. I made it to the hospital, got a few stitches, and was sent on my way. By the time I got home, the adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a sickening realization. I was probably never going to hear from her again. Not after that. I sent her a text anyway, something short and light. Well, that was the most awkward first meeting in history. Sorry you had to deal with that. She didn't respond. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. She unmatched me on Tinder, too. It wasn't hard to figure out why. To her, I probably looked like exactly the kind of guy she was trying to avoid, a walking, bleeding embodiment of her worst dating instincts. Now I can laugh about it. At the time, though, it was brutal. I'd gone from riding the high of matching with someone genuinely cool to crashing into the absolute worst first impression imaginable. The irony still kills me. Out of all the ambulances in the city, it had to be hers. Out of all the things I could have been doing, I had to be sitting there looking like the poster boy for bad life choices. I can't blame her for ghosting me. I mean, what would you do if you rolled up to a scene and saw a guy you were planning to date sitting on the sidewalk, bleeding from a knife wound, with weed scattered around him? Exactly. Now, whenever I tell this story, it always gets a laugh. It's ridiculous, right? The kind of thing that sounds too absurd to be real. But it happened, and I've got the scar to prove it. If nothing else, it taught me to keep my gold chain at home, and maybe rethink carrying weed in my pocket when I'm out for a walk. And hey, at least I never have to answer the question, what's your worst first impression story, again. This one's got it locked down.